I cannot speak for the life of me today. It's a lot better. Welcome back to another video, guys. My name's Tanner, and if you know me, great. If not, I've been a working photographer for 5 years, and I'm going to make some videos to help people out. I don't have anything better to do. In this video, we're going to be going in depth on aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and how all of these things affect your light meter. Your light meter is a little device in your camera that shows you the exposure of your photo, if you're overexposed, underexposed, or if you're perfectly exposed. It's usually represented by a little number line or a number with a plus or minus next to it, but it's pretty simple to understand. If you're on the negative side of your light meter, then you are underexposed. If you're on the positive side, then you're a little too exposed or overexposed. If you're right in the middle, then you're perfect. So if we take a look at my Sony camera right here, you can see that little blinking number down there, -2. That is actually the light meter. Because it's pointed directly at my black shirt, it's saying that, hey, it's too dark. There's not enough light here. So I need to change either my shutter speed, my aperture, or my ISO to lighten up the exposure in order to get a perfect photo. So we're going to start off with aperture. And aperture is the first thing I set when I'm shooting manual. Aperture, sometimes called iris or f-stop, is a representation of the size of the hole that's opening inside your lens to let light in. It's represented by an F number. Your camera might display it as F number or just the number. So let's say you have an aperture of 1.8. Your camera might say f1.8 or 1.8. In the case of my Sony right here, it has an F next to it. So that aperture or F number, the higher that number is, the smaller the hole is in the lens. So a smaller hole means less light is coming in. A wider hole means more light is coming in. So if you're at f1.8, that's wide open. If you're at f22, that's really small. So here I have this Carl Zeiss 35mm f2.8 lens. Right now, if you look in the middle, it's wide open at 2.8. Now it's at f22. You see how much smaller that is? So here I am at f22, way too dark. Camera's even having a hard time focusing. So if I open it up all the way to 2.8, now it's a little too bright. See how my light meter's at plus 0.7? A little too bright. Let's close it a little bit. And right there, at f4, this scene at ISO 500 and 1/10 of a shutter, which is honestly too long, it's perfectly exposed. Another thing to consider when you're changing your aperture is depth of field. It's not simply just a matter of less light, more light. So for another quick example when it comes to depth of field for aperture is actually what you're looking at right now. I currently have on my camera an old Minolta film portrait lens. It's a 50mm f1.4, but the aperture right now is at f5.6. So look at the background behind me and then watch how it changes after I change it to 1.4. Now here we are at 1.4. Really only my face is in focus. Everything else behind me is just gone. If you look at the lights on my computer, they're little circles. It just looks a lot better. So if you're doing portrait photography, you want a lens with a super low aperture, no question. You're not going to get that on like a kit lens on a T6i or a kit lens on a Sony a6000. They can't go that low enough. You'll get a blurry background, but it won't be as aesthetically pleasing to the eye as something at like a 1.8 or a 1.4. If I was shooting this video at f22, well, first off, it would be too dark, but let's say the light allowed for it. You wouldn't really get this blur behind me. It might be blurred a little bit, but not to the degree that it is right now. Essentially, what I'm saying is that a small aperture, which means a high F number, gives you a much wider plane of focus. And that's useful for doing things like landscapes or street photography, especially long exposures. Shutter speed is a measurement for how long you allow light to flash onto your sensor. When you take a photo, the shutter lifts up, light exposes, and then it closes. And then that's your photo. Shutter speed is represented as a fraction. 1/500 would be 1/500th of a second. 1/50 would be 1/50th of a second. 1/5 would be 1/5 of a second, and so on. 1/5 of a second is obviously a lot longer than 1/5000th of a second. This really only matters when it comes to things like action photography or long exposures. If you're taking a photo of your friend skateboarding and you want to get him doing a kickflip or something? Well, you're going to want a pretty fast shutter speed because you want to freeze him in time. So shutter speed matters when you want to take those really nice, aesthetically pleasing landscape photos as well. Like, I'm sure you've all seen those like annual calendars with all the beach photos in them, and you're just like, how does anybody get a photo like this? Like, what is going on? All that's going on is somebody has their shutter open for a long time to capture the motion of all the things that are moving, mainly the water on the beach, and then everything else stays still, and it gives a really cool effect. It's called a long exposure. If you move your shutter all the way back in the fractions, it'll actually start turning into a number with a quotation mark next to it. So right now, if we look at my light meter, it's -2, so it's a little dark. If we move the shutter here to the left, it starts brightening up. But then if we go too far here, it starts getting overexposed. See these quotation marks right here? That's seconds. 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds. That means your shutter is open for a whole 10 seconds. Now, nobody can really hold their camera completely still for 10 seconds. If you can, send me a video of it because that's insane. So most long exposures and things like that are done on tripods. When you're shooting a long exposure, your aperture is most likely going to be a higher f number, so you can get more things in focus, and your ISO also very low, so you can actually have your shutter open for that amount of time and have a perfectly exposed photo. The issue is that if you're doing it in broad daylight, you could have your ISO as low as possible and your aperture all the way to f22, and then even a 5-second exposure might still be way too bright. In that case, you would need to get one of these. I don't know where my ND filter is. This is not good. This is a variable ND filter. It's essentially a little piece of tinted glass that literally just you put on the end of your lens and it makes everything darker. So like I said, this one's variable, so I can actually make it darker or lighter just by twisting it, which I'll demonstrate for you right now. Here we are, light, and see how I'm darkening it up and dark. Light, dark. I don't know why my monitor's going in and out like that. That's super weird. Kind of cool though. So a quick review. Aperture is taking away or adding light to a photo by changing the size of the hole in your lens. That also affects your depth of field. Shutter speed is how long your shutter is open for. How do you change these two things when you're shooting in manual? Well, there's most likely on your camera a knob by your pointer finger by the shutter and a knob by your thumb. So on my Sony camera right here, the aperture is controlled by this knob up here. If I flip it around, the shutter is controlled by this knob right here. And if you want to change those around in the settings, most cameras allow you to do that. So that leaves us with ISO. Just another thing to take away or add light to your photo, just in a different way. The way that ISO does it is just by digitally blowing up the picture in your camera. It's represented again by numbers on a scale from 50 all the way up to the hundreds of thousands. When you blow up your ISO to a higher value, you're going to notice a lot more grain in your photo, and that's what we call noise. Some people like that and some people don't. It really just depends on what you're going for. And that's the beautiful thing about being an artist. So why would you ever need to blow up your ISO like that? Well, let's say you're shooting like an indoor basketball game and you have a zoom lens and the aperture is only a 3.5 to 5.6. You're all the way zoomed out, so the lowest you can go is a 5.6, and you also need to have your shutter really fast, and it's still too dark. You can't open your aperture anymore, and you can't go any lower on your shutter or else you're going to start getting blurry photos. So your last resort is ISO, so you just blow it up. So here I am at 1/500th on my shutter and f2.8. I don't want to go any lower on my shutter, and I physically can't go any lower on my aperture. So I'm going to have to click the ISO button and blow it up. See that? Just gets brighter. Now we're at ISO 4000. I'm still too dark, -1.7. Let's move that up. ISO 16,000. That's perfectly exposed. Now the thing is, this photo is probably going to appear pretty grainy. ISO is also pretty much directly comparable to film speeds if you're ever shooting on film. Let's say you're shooting on Cinestill 800T. This is essentially ISO 800 if you were to compare it to the digital world. If you don't know what this is, it's film that goes into a film camera like this. It's how we took photos back in the old days. If I confused you by saying back in the old days, I'm actually 57 years old. Alright, so if you guys enjoyed the video and it helped you out, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. If not, don't do those things and never watch a video of mine again. But really, if it helped you out, let me know in the comments. If I didn't help you out, still let me know in the comments, and I'll try and answer any questions I can. I'm still new to this, and it's a pretty tough experience. But anyway, I'll be back next week with another video of something photography related.